September 13th, 2020. In many respects, it was a lovely day. It was so nice to be able to see so many parishioners back in the sanctuary, joining us in person. And we held two services that day, the 8:30 and the 10 o'clock, and I was responsible for recording and broadcasting the 10 o'clock service. And the goal at the time, as I had said in the return to in-person worship video, was to have that service premiere online live at 12:30 p.m. So about the service usually wrapped up around 11, so about an hour and a half later. And I felt that was a perfectly reasonable turnaround time estimate, and I was very wrong. And there's a couple of reasons for that, but one of the biggest reasons was, in fact, that the services that we were recording in person were longer. Services that we recorded during the summer were services of the Word, most typically anyway. There's a couple of spiritual communions in there, but generally speaking, they're services of the Word. And that means that there's no communion, which is definitely a large factor in cutting down time, especially when there's an in-person worship service like this one, where you have a large congregation that needs to be given communion, and it's also a little bit slower now compared to how it maybe was back in March, because we have to socially distance everyone, and it's you can't have a whole bunch of people just lined up along the altar rails as we used to be able to. So that was one of the big first issues. But stepping back from that even for a moment, there was a lot of prep that did go into this. One of the things that we talked about a lot was whether or not we should just live stream it like we did on Lent 4. And in the meantime, during the summer, we had changed internet service providers, so we had much better internet throughout the building, especially in the sanctuary. So it was possible, but ultimately at the time I felt that we could put out a better quality service and reach more people if we just had it out by 12:30, and that way people won't run into issues with the live stream not loading and this, that, and the other. Was my thought at the time. But, of course, that turnaround time was far too optimistic, and I think my opinion very quickly changed on that when I realized it wasn't going to be more like until 3 o'clock-ish, when those videos were going to go live on YouTube. But, nevertheless, that wasn't the only reason this was stressful, this first Sunday. One of the things that we did in preparation for this was we built this post, as Peter likes to call it. And this post is mounted here in the center of this pew, and it is intended to hold the cameras that point towards the lectern for the gospel, and in this case the sermon, and also it is intended to provide the camera for the altar, which is now on an angle because we need that middle aisle open for communion. And so that's what this post was designed for, and the fun thing was me and my procrastinating self decided to wait until that morning to install the post. And initially this post it had a very different design to the one that you see in that video. It was much more rudimentary, and you can kind of see the post in this image up kind of underneath that banner there near the lectern. And so that was one factor. And the other thing is I was using Archdeacon Peter's phone as one of the camera angles. I think it actually is the phone on that post that is for the lectern. And the problem is I made a mistake and set it to record at the lovely resolution of 4K. And 4K is a beautiful resolution, but the problem is it is a gigantic file size, especially when you're recording for an hour. And that means that I think we ended up with like a 24, 25 gigabyte file just for one camera angle, which is kind of a nightmare to try to maneuver around when you're not really able to plug in because it was his phone trying to talk to my computer, which it didn't like, and obviously it's not like a camera. That's one downside to using mobile devices, where you can just hot swap out an SD card or something like that. So all in all, it was a bit of a mess. I think I actually ended up accidentally deleting the footage from Peter's phone that day. So and it was such a large file size that even the proprietary AirDrop system wasn't working, which is a great system broadly speaking. And so I kind of had to accept defeat a little bit on that day, and it was a rough one. But one of the things that is interesting, and that also made it a little bit harder, is for the first time, we're pulling the audio for the service from our built-in sound system. And we are doing this much in the same way that the Venerable Peter Scott had been recording his sermons prior. We just grabbed a laptop and plugged into a 3.5 millimeter headphone jack and recorded it as a voice memo right off the soundboard, and then took that and went straight into iMovie with it, and we were still using iMovie at this time, and then we painfully aligned each shot once we eventually got them, and tried our best to make the mouse match up with the audio. And sometimes iMovie also during the summer of 2020, I forgot to mention, had a horrible bug that would sometimes cause voices to randomly shift, like the audio files to randomly shift by a couple of seconds, which would just throw all of your hard work right off, which was quite annoying. But nevertheless, that was one interesting development from this, and it kind of helped us move towards a new way of recording things. So once we got past this 15th Sunday after Pentecost service, which was definitely an interesting service from the perspective of doing things new, you can see that we had Spark Story Bible readings set up in that such way, and we had this new back camera angle, which kind of gave you the more of a sense that you're sitting in the congregation. All in all, it was a important service to go through, but it was definitely a bit of a different one. And one of the problems we had also with recording during the fall, at least during the early fall, was we had to figure out how to set up the music for recording, because obviously before, when we were pre-recording, we could be really fancy with lyrics set up, and those lyrics in the videos were set up so that they were simply edited in as text files in iMovie and then just exported from there. And it's funny to look at those now because no one's wearing masks, and it's also kind of frustrating because we filmed all of that as best we could to allow us to reuse that video footage, but unfortunately we didn't foresee the future. Nevertheless, one of the problems we had was we couldn't really go back to that when we were broadcasting or live like this, because we obviously wanted to use the footage and the music that Greg and Nancy and the rest of the choir were producing live, as opposed to just inserting existing pre-recorded footage and music. So we had to kind of work around that a little bit. It was definitely an interesting task to get around, but as we kind of moved forward into the year, we were able to innovate a little bit more. Throughout the summer of 2020 and then later into the fall, we recorded a lot of background footage which we would insert into services. We did this sometimes to serve as a bit of a prelude and set kind of a theme. I always liked it because it was one of the things that allowed me to kind of inject my own kind of artistic flavor a little bit, if you will. But we kind of had to take a break from that when we moved back to in-person worship, because we had all this lovely footage, first of all, of the congregation being back, but also we were on a real time crunch, and there wasn't a lot of time for, overlaying certain things and messing around that way. So when it came time to I want to say about a month into the return to in-person, I decided that I wasn't really happy with how things were going in terms of how we were producing our services, because it was taking a long time, longer than I wanted, for services to go live. I was not meeting my goal. I think even like 2 o'clock-ish was hard, and it's, church is a Sunday morning thing, ideally, and so I decided to back down a little bit on my opinion on live streaming and give it another shot. And initially, I just tried it with a single camera in the corner, of just streaming to Facebook, and just kind of experimenting, seeing, if there'd be an uptake, and there was. So I thought, okay, I need to find a better piece of software that will let me inject some of the characteristics that I like that editing provides, while also letting us still have live streaming. And one of the big things I was interested in was multiple camera angles, because obviously you can do it relatively simply with OBS and a series of other software and hardware, but it does get expensive fast. So we found a alternative called Switcher Studio, and it's what we use to record this service. And as you can see, we're still located partially on our pole here in the center of the pew, pointing towards the altar as our main camera, and then there's a second camera pointing towards the lectern, and a third over kind of down for the sermon, because Peter likes to come down for his sermon, and kind of close to the grand piano. So we had to kind of adjust the setup a little bit for that. But Switcher is an interesting piece of software that essentially allows us to connect multiple phones together, and stream them all simultaneously, and then just stitch them together in what's referred to as live editing. And so that allowed us to return the background footage that I love to add in as you start at the start of this service. But it also allowed us to improve our audio situation and editing times dramatically, because we were able to take the audio from the sound system and use this thing called a preamp, I do believe anyway, and we were able to use that to convert our analog soundboard signal straight to a digital signal, which could be read by an iPad, which then had Switcher Studio installed on it. And so the iPad basically operates as a base station, and all the phones stream to it, and then the iPad streams out to Facebook, or in fact YouTube, as we sometimes do now. So this service was one of the first ones to use that technology, I do believe, and it made a huge difference, especially for the people watching live, because it meant that you could have audio that wasn't just a phone microphone, and in fact was the live audio from the service. And it made such a difference in terms of not having to try to line up audio and stuff, that I still use it today, even when we are pre-recording services. It is a great product that saves a lot of time. So it is one I would definitely recommend to anyone that does a lot of online content and streaming. Um, so Switcher is something that, though, took a little bit of time, and it's also a piece of software that sometimes doesn't like slightly older phones for whatever reason, with certain glitches which can be extraordinarily frustrating. But nevertheless, we soldiered on and continued to experiment with it, and I think with relatively promising results. So this was one of our first services with it. We'd had a couple in the past, but this is one of the ones where things went a little smoother. Now, if you're paying particularly close attention watching some of these services, especially in the lectern view, you'll notice that there's a good amount of vibration, and you may be wondering why. And even sometimes now you'll see in certain frames, especially around the grand piano, a good amount of vibration. And it's not just vibration from me, being close to it, or the cameras, that is, or, shaking the desk a little bit and seeing this plant vibrate. Part of the problem with recording in an old building is you get a lot of its characteristics and features, and that can be both very nice in terms of the beautiful tapestries and the gorgeous stained glass within the building, but you also get some of its quirks. And one of the things we had to be particularly careful of early on was editing out the gigantic noise of the squeaky floor. And, we still left it in a little bit because it does add to the charm and character of the building, but in addition to the squeaks the floor makes, it is also very, very unstable in some areas, and unfortunately that can be seen a little bit here. You can see the jittering of the camera, and you can see it less in this angle, which is used for sermons, of course, because this is fastened directly to a concrete wall. So it's a little bit of a better situation for recording. As we moved throughout the fall and closer to winter, we of course crossed over into the beautiful season of Advent, one of my personal favorites. And we were starting to hear rumbles about this thing called a second wave in the pandemic. And we weren't really sure what would happen, but as far as we were concerned, things were still a go, and we planned for things to be a go for Christmas Eve. And the first thing that we did with respect to that is we began to plan using Eventbrite to have a number of people come into the church. And I was doing a lot of stuff in the background to try to make sure that I would be ready for live streaming the services that are the Christmas Eve services. However, of course, the Premier of Ontario announced that there would be a lockdown starting on Boxing Day. And I think our Bishop Susan Bell made a wise choice in canceling church services, including Christmas Eve, just following the fourth Advent service. And obviously that's a rough situation to find yourself in. but it's also reassuring when you know that you're doing something that is hopefully going to have a positive impact. And in fact, the fourth Sunday of Advent is the last time we were in person as of the recording of this video, which is hard to believe. But nevertheless, it was an informative service, and just like the third Sunday of Advent service was before it. And as you can see, we had the altar guild who had beautifully done up the church with Christmas flowers and all the garland and the beautiful Christmas trees, the Advent tree, and the beautiful interior of the narthex as well. But from my perspective, for most of the fall, the once we switched our studio, things went a lot smoother. There are still some odd technical hiccups and glitches and issues with network connectivity every now and then, and so on and so forth. But things fell into a rhythm, and we were going quite well. But then, of course, the closure came, and well, that is quite the story that we will leave for the next episode. If you like this content, please consider subscribing to us if you haven't already. And if you have enjoyed it, please leave a like down at the bottom and a comment if you wish. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next week. Thanks. Goodbye.